The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings, and of civilization in the Near East from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Will Durant. Chapter 20. Letters and Arts in the 4th Century. Section 4. Apelles. The highest excellence of the 4th century lay not in literature, but in philosophy and art. In art, as in politics, the individual liberated himself from the temple, the state, the tradition, and the school. Its patriotic devotion yielded to private loyalties. Architecture took on a more modest scale and became increasingly secular. The great choral forms of music and dance made way for private performances by professionals. Painting and sculpture continued to adorn public buildings, with the representation of gods or noble human types, but at the same time they entered upon that service and portrayal of living individuals which characterized the succeeding age. Where cities could still afford to patronize art on a national scale, it was because, like Cnidus, Halicarnassus, or Ephesus, they had not been deeply touched by war, or like Syracuse, had found in natural resources and governmental order the means of a rapid recovery. On the mainland, architecture marked time. In 338 BCE, Lycurgus rebuilt the theater of Dionysus, the stadium, and the Lyceum, and under his administration, Philon raised an impressive arsenal at the Piraeus. As the tendency to a delicate refinement increased, the Doric order became less fashionable. Its stern simplicity, finding no counterpart in the soul, the Ionic style rose in popularity and served as an architectural analog to Praxiteles' elegance and Plata's charm, while the Corinthian order made modest conquests in the Tower of the Winds and the choragic monument of Lysicrates at Arcadian Tegea. Scopas raised a temple of Athena in all three styles, one colonnade Doric, another Ionic, another Corinthian, and beautified it with statuary from his own masculine hand. Vaster and more famous was the third temple of Artemis at Ephesus. The second temple had burned down on the day of Alexander's birth in 356 BCE, a coincidence which, says the usual kindly Plutarch, Hegesias of Magnesia, made the occasion of a conceit frigid enough to have stopped the conflagration. The new building was begun soon afterward, and was completed by the end of the century. Alexander offered to bear the whole cost of the work if his name as a donor were recorded on the edifice, but the proud Greeks of Ephesus refused for the disarming or possible satirical reason that it was not meet for one god to build a temple to another. Nevertheless, Alexander's favorite architect, Dinocrates, designed the temple on a scale that made it the largest in Hellas. 36 of the columns were carved with bas-reliefs by various sculptors, including the ubiquitous Scopas. One sculptured column drum survives in the British Museum, as if to prove by its drapery alone that Greek sculpture was still near the height of its curve. The heads of the figures are not immobile and idealized types, but individualized faces, alive with feeling and character, a premonition of Hellenistic realism. At the opposite extreme of size, the 4th century distinguished itself in terracotta statuettes. Boeotian Tanagra made its name synonymous with little figures in baked and unglazed clay, cast in generalized types, but then molded and painted by hand into 1,000 individual shapes, quick with the color and variety of common life. As in earlier centuries, painting was called in to aid other arts, but now it acquired an independent status and dignity, and its masters received commissions from all the Greek world. Pamphilus of Amphipolis, who taught Apelles, refused to take any pupil for less than 12 years, and charged 6,000 for the course. Manassan, dictator of Locrian Elatia, paid 10 minas for each of the 100 figures in a battle seen by Aristides Thebes, making 100,000 for one painting, and the same enthusiast gave Asclepiodorus 360,000. 1938 US is what this is estimated as, right? For a panel of the 12 major Olympians. Lucullus paid 12,000 for a copy of the portrait that Pausius of Sicyon had painted of Menander's mistress, Glaucera. A picture by Apelles, says Pliny, sold for a sum equal to the treasuries of whole cities. Apelles of Kos, says the same enthusiastic amateur, surpassed all the other painters who either preceded or succeeded him. Single-handed, he contributed more to painting than all the others together. Apelles must have been supreme in his day in art, since he could afford the rare extravagance of praising other painters, learning that his greatest rival, Protogenes, was living in poverty. Apelles sailed for Rhodes to visit him. Protogenes, unwarned, was not in his studio when Apelles came. An old woman attendant asked Apelles whom she should name as visitor when her master returned. Apelles replied only by taking a brush and tracing upon a panel with one stroke an outline of exceeding fineness. When Protogenes came back, the old woman regretted that she could not tell him the name of his departed visitor, but Protogenes, seeing the outline and noting its delicacy, exclaimed, "Only Apelles could have drawn that line." And then he drew a still finer line within that of Apelles, and bade the woman show it if the stranger should return. Apelles came, marveled at the absent Protogenes' skill, but drew between the two lines a third of such slenderness and grace that when Protogenes saw it, he confessed himself surpassed, and rushed to the harbor to detain and welcome Apelles. The panel was transmitted as a masterpiece from generation to generation until it was brought by Julius Caesar. I don't think there was a J at that time. But yeah, and perished in the fire that destroyed his palace on the Palatine Hill. Remember, in Latin, the C's are always pronounced as a K. Anxious to awaken the Greek world to Protogenes' worth, Apelles asked him what he wanted for some of his paintings. Protogenes mentioned a modest sum, but Apelles offered him instead 50 talents, $300,000, 1938 US, and then circulated a report that he intended to sell these works as his own. The Rhodians, aroused to a better appreciation of their artist, paid Protogenes more than the sum Apelles had named, and kept the pictures among the public treasuries of the city. Apelles, meanwhile, had captured the plaudits of the Greek world by his painting of Aphrodite, Anna Daomene, i.e. Aphrodite, rising from the sea. Alexander sent for him and set for many portraits. The young conqueror was not satisfied with the representation of his horse, Apelles, in one of these pictures, and had the animal brought closer to the panel for comparison. Apelles, looking at the picture, whinnied, whereupon Apelles remarked, "Your Majesty's horse seems to know more about painting than you do." On another occasion, when the king was holding forth about art in Apelles' studio, Apelles begged him to talk of anything else, lest the boys who were grinding the colors should laugh at him. Alexander took it good-naturedly, and when he engaged the artist to paint his favorite concubine, and Apelles fell in love with her, the king sent her to him as a gift. Over his finished pictures, Apelles painted a thin coat of varnish, which preserved the colors, softened their glare, and yet made them livelier than before. He worked to the last, and death came upon him while he was once more delineating the eternal Aphrodite. And we do see here definitely the graven image thing. The earlier commands in ancient Egyptian and Semitic religion against graven images were written with alphabets that had faces and other pictures in it. So what was the difference? Well, that was the alphabet. It wasn't like they were trying to, depict things that way.